All right, in this video, I want to give you an example of how to do an indirect proof, like we see in chapter 8, section H. So let's say we've got this problem. We're given one premise. If, it's not Q. If not Q, then not S. And if not S, then S. And the conclusion we're supposed to get to is Q. All right, now here's what I think that I would be led to use indirect proof. If you look at this, all I've got is a pair of conditional statements. And I don't know how to get from a pair of conditional statements to one of the antecedents. There's no real good way to do that. Furthermore, if you just sit and stare at that first premise for a second, you're going to see something weird about it. Look, if S is not the case, then S is the case. In other words, it's like they've got S as true and false at the same time. If S is the case, then you can't have that. So in other words, there's a contradiction built into premise one. Now, why does that lead me to think about using an indirect proof? Well, here's why. An indirect proof, you say, let's assume something. And let's show that if we make that assumption, it's going to lead us to a contradiction. Well, look, I know I've got a contradiction built in there. I can assume anything, and it's going to lead to a contradiction. And then I can conclude that the opposite of my assumption is true. So if I'm trying to get to Q, then what I can do is this. I can assume that not Q is the case. I can show that it leads to a contradiction, not S and S being true at the same time. And then I can conclude from that that therefore not Q is false, not Q is true. And of course, not Q is the same thing as Q. So I assume the opposite of what I wanted to eventually get to, that's going to lead to a contradiction. I can then conclude to what I want to get to. That's why I decided to use the indirect proof method. So when I set up the indirect proof method, usually the way they taught you to do it in the book, you're going to want to indent the indirect proof part. I'm just making it in red because that's easier for me on PowerPoint. So the way you start it is you assume like the opposite of what you actually want to conclude. So I want to actually conclude Q. I'm going to assume not Q, and I put assumption indirect proof. And then somehow I'm going to get to a contradiction. In this case, that's what I'm gunning for. And then when I discharge the conclusion, it's going to be not Q, the opposite of that assumption, right? And the justification for that will be lines 2 through whatever this ends up being, indirect proof. And I get this final step, double negation, and that would get me my conclusion. So I'm leaving blanks here where I'm going to fill in the line numbers once I figure out what those are. Okay, so with this setup, what I want to do now is figure out how am I going to get not S and S out of this? Now, it all falls out pretty easily, but if I'm thinking backwards from this final line, probably I'm going to have to get each one of those individually and then put them together with conjunction. So I want to get not S, and then I want to get S, and I'll paste them together with this rule. That's what will justify that move. So now that backs me up, and I want to prove not S, and then I want to prove S. So how am I going to get not S from this stuff? Well, check it out. I've got this conditional here. If not Q, then not S. And I've assumed not Q. So what rule do you know that could get me from this conditional and this to not S? One of my favorites, that's right, it's modus ponens. Now, before I use modus ponens, I'm going to have to get this conditional statement alone by itself, which means I'm going to have to break apart this conjunction. See that dot there? That makes it a conjunction. That makes this one of the conjuncts. What rule will break apart a conjunction for me? That's right, dear friends. It's simplification. So by simplification, I get this part by itself, and then I can run modus ponens, and that'll give me not S. So I'm halfway there. Now all I've got to do is prove S. Well, that's easy now. Remember this other conjunct? This is really the source of the contradiction in the first place. If not S is true, then S. So I basically need to do the same thing again. First of all, I use simplification to break that out on its own. I've got if not S, then S. And then by modus ponens, S follows. Now I've got both pieces of the contradiction that I was trying to get to. Not S and S, I put them together in one line with conjunction. And now I'm good. Now I just got to fill in my line numbers, right? Because then I can discharge that. I come to my contradiction. If we assume not Q, we get to this contradiction. And so therefore the assumption must be false. Not Q is true. And and then by double negation, Q follows. Okay, so what are the lessons we learn here? We're working backwards like we do in any proof. And we learned that you can, when you do an assumption, an indirect proof assumption, you're going to assume the opposite of what you actually want to conclude to. And then you generate a contradiction. It can be any contradiction, but that's what you're gunning for at the end of an indirect proof. And then the conclusion that you draw is the opposite of the assumption. Hope that helps.